Good morning from New York and New Jersey. This is the top three Dream Theater albums, the fifth installment of our series and the last of this series. And we're going to start out with Sean's number three, which I'm going to bring up on my screen, is Images and Words. Sean, take it away.
Okay, so this is the Dream Theater album that is the blueprint for the band's sound. Okay, it would kind of be the framework for success. After the commercial failure of the first album, When Dream and Day Unite, this is an album where they had to make a great album in order to continue on, and they nailed it here. Pull Me Under is a phenomenal song with innovative songwriting. I love the prominent use of the keyboards in that song. Metropolis Part 1 was a huge risk for any band at that time. If you listen to the other quote unquote prog metal bands from that era, like Fates Warning, Voivod, Watchtower, Crimson Glory, all those bands were taking some risks, but nothing like this. This song stands out as a monument for innovative progressive songwriting. You can definitely hear the 21st century schizoid man influence in the instrumental section of Metropolis Part 1. Um, and nobody else was doing anything like Metropolis Part 1 in the late 80s or early 90s. The instrumentation, execution, and the triumphant ending of that song blows you away every time. Take the Time has some great prog rock instrumental guitar parts, cool melodic lead guitar parts. The singing by James LeBray on this particular song is just out of this world. This is the first time we hear the repeating riffs that they use. If you listen to the E minor melody in Pull Me Under, that riff is repeated briefly in Take the Time in E major. I love the production on this album. I love the mix. I think it may still stand as the best album where you can hear John Mayung particularly well. The vocal projection in the mix I love, and I even like the triggered snare by Mike Portnoy. I would compare this album to Close to the Edge by Yes from, I think that was 1971 or 72. You may have to fact check me on that because there was nothing else like it at the time. Maybe Control and Resistance by Watchtower is somewhat similar, but there's no keyboards on that album. What metal band had keyboards back then? And if you listen to the 1 million Dream Theater worship bands today, you can tell each one of them was influenced by this album, especially the guitar playing.
Yeah, super strong throughout. Obviously, this is what kicked Dream Theater off into their career. Without this album, actually, perhaps without Pull Me Under, they probably would not have gained the recognition, the widespread appeal of the band in general. They hit a home run with Metropolis Part 1. Obviously, you alluded to 21st Century Schizoid Man as being an influence. This is really the album that kicked everything off for Dream Theater. I've got it a little bit higher on my list. I'll give you some more of my comments later, but basically this is just top to bottom. I think the standard bearer of all progressive metal. If you want to nitpick, some people don't like the triggered snare. I think it works. I think it adds an interesting element to the album. Some people think it's dated. Some people think Another Day and Surrounded are a bit too call it 80s commercial poser rock. Some people still look at those two songs that way. I don't. I think they stand the test of time. But we'll come back to my comments in a little bit. Right now, we're going to go to my number three album, which is the 2002 release. This album was released in January of 2002, and it's their longest album. It's 2 CDs, and I'm speaking of 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. So listen, as far as songwriting, they knock it out of the park with this album. I think it's their best collection. If you just look at it as a collection of songs, I think 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence is their best album. I have it ranked 3 out of 15. Starts off with part of that 12-step suite, the five song collection, the Glass Prison. Some interesting guitar parts on that, heavily influenced by Steve Howe in Heart of the Sunrise. You can hear Petrucci kind of mirroring that riff. Blind Faith, another one of my favorite Dream Theater songs. Interesting lyrical contribution by James LaBrie. Great harmony with keyboards and guitar solo in the middle section. This is just top to bottom a classic Dream Theater album. They were coming off of Metropolis Part 2, trying to one up that album, which I think they did. I think they actually improved. This is James LaBrie in his prime. I like some of the other aspects of the album that I like are obviously Misunderstood, which is kind of John Petrucci's version of Limelight by Neil Peart. It's how he feels being in the spotlight and being thought of as superhuman, being misunderstood. I think there's some interesting octobon patterns that Portnoy plays in a little bit different tempo underneath Petrucci's picking. I would say, if you're gonna nitpick about this album, you could say the drums are a little bit too loud, maybe a little bit. They get almost to the point of distortion on some of the fills. Overall, the drums do sound good. They sound powerful throughout. I think James LaBrie on this album has a masterful performance throughout. I love his lyrical contributions on, as I said, Blind Faith and Disappear. His vocals are sad and moody, which is a highlight of the album on Disappear. Lyrically, I think it's interesting. As far as the rest of the album, there's an interesting political song called "The Great Debate," penned by Petrucci. Love the fierce guitar riff on that song. Love the intro with Portnoy's toms. I think that's a highlight of the album. I love how they do the clever mix of the liberal opinion in the left speaker and the conservative opinion of StelSem Research in the right speaker. So I think that's kind of clever how they did that. Soulful melodies throughout. Just can't say enough about this album. As far as the title track, the 42-minute dramatic turn of event, it's a dramatic 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. Love the references to various influences throughout. They got some interesting lyrics from Portnoy and Petrucci as far as mental illness and things like schizophrenia, bipolar, postpartum depression. I think the highlight of 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, the title track, is The Test That Stumped Them All, which is a reference musically to One by Metallica. So look, I can't say more about this album. I think musically and lyrically, they hit it out of the park. It's my number 3. And that's kind of where I am on that. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll get to my most of what I had planned on saying in a little while, but I think you're spot on there. It's I believe it's their best. So.
Okay. All right, so we'll move on. We're gonna look at. So that was my number 3. Your number 3 was Images and Words. Your number 2, I had it a little bit lower on my list. I had it at number 5, but your number 2 is Metropolis Part 2, the epic Scenes from a Memory. and this was released in October of 1999, just about 25 years ago. There's the track listing. Sean, take it away.
All right, so what else can you say about this? The thing's a masterpiece. Um, there's drama, there's great melodies. The Kevin Shirley mix is spot on. The high point for me is Home, the 12-minute epic with a mix of heaviness of the seven-string guitar, the bass being prominent in the mix, the soaring vocals that you get from James LaBrie. There's plenty of great technical playing and great songwriting from the beginning of the album. Dance of Eternity is a great instrumental. If you love technical playing, it's all there for you. I'm not sure this is the best progressive instrumental of all time. I think that might be La Villa Strangiato by Rush. At least that would be up there. But in terms of pure technicality, it's a top-notch instrumental all the way. What stands out as the album progresses for me is the great melodies. Apparently, Mike Portnoy wanted the guitar melodies to bind the songs together, much like what you hear on Misplaced Childhood by Marillion. I think that's what makes the album work, or one of the things that makes the album work, especially towards the end of the album with that great lead guitar melody and The Spirit Carries On, which leads into the final track. But to this day, in terms of popularity, it's still one of the most popular albums. And this is where we first hear Jordan. Jordan, I think, stands out and really, makes the band, brings the final piece of the puzzle to allow the band to be at its strongest in terms of songwriting and just kind of complementing the sound of the rest of the musicians.
Yeah, and really, I said this on one of our previous podcasts, but this is really Mike Portnoy at his best as a producer and as a drummer. He made a point to come up with, this was the album he always wanted to make. He always wanted to make a big concept album. Obviously, instrumentation and the instrumental sections are key on this album. You hear, one of their most melodic and challenging songs instrumentally is Overture 1928. Love the keyboards on that. Lots of references to Metropolis Part 1. You mentioned Dance of Eternity. I think that stands out as the most technically challenging and progressive instrumental in the history of the genre. I had this number 5, so I had it a little bit lower. I think one of the things you point out, which I agree with, is how perfectly balanced everything is in the mix. That's not always the case when you have, 5 people yearning to be at the top of the mix. It all sounds perfectly balanced, perfectly mixed. I think you made a good point with how Kevin Shirley did the majority of the mixes on this album. I love Petrucci's heaviness with, I think in spots, I think you said there was a 7-string. Love the Metropolis 1 reference on Home. Do you think the lyrics are a bit lacking? I think they're a little bit forced. I think maybe, I just think it was a little forced, and but having said that, it does have an interesting storyline. It does have an interesting plot twist, and I gave you my comments on one of our other podcasts. So for now, we're going to go to my number 2, which was your number 5. So we kind of had it reversed. We're going to go to my number 2 album, which is the 1994 release by Dream Theater, and this is Awake. Awake was so this is the follow-up to Images and Words. Came out, I believe it came. It came out in 1994, October 1994, I think, October 4th. So it just had its 30th year anniversary. So a couple of big anniversaries there. Right off the bat, Portnoy wanted to make a statement. Drums are not going to sound triggered. The drums are going to sound nothing like what he was against on Images and Words. Ultimately, he did not like this trigger snare. He's never used it since. And he made a statement on 6 o'clock. It starts out with this big drum beat. It was actually written by Kevin Moore because he wrote the song 6 o'clock and he wrote the drum beat. But Portnoy comes out and just a big snare sound, big toms, big bass drum sound. They recorded it in this big room in LA. You can see a picture of it on the CD insert. You can hear how loud the drums are and how prominent the drums are. The natural, acoustic, organic sound that Portnoy really wanted to get on this album, I think he achieves. Some of the things I like about this album are this is the one Dream Theater album where all 5 band members made a lyrical contribution. Track 2, Caught in a Web, lyrics were written by James LaBrie. It's the first lyrical contribution by him. I think that's important to note. Some of the other great things about this album. This is the heaviest guitar sounding album to date by Dream Theater. You mentioned that Petrucci started using the 7-string on some of these songs. This is a very heavy album in a lot of ways. It's a dark album. Some of the moodier pieces like Space Divest and 6 O'Clock, The Mirror, these are all dark songs. Kevin Moore introduces us to distortion on the keyboards, which I think is a very interesting sound. His keyboards sound very little. There's very little similarities. But, this is it's weird because there's very few similarities between Awake and Images and Words. These 2 albums came out within 2 years of each other, but they really did try to make an album that sounded a little bit similar to the grunge movement, the grunge genre that was very popular at the time. I think you mentioned they were, some of the sounds they got were similar to Alice in Chains, Soundgarden. Some of the other things I like on this album are some of the double bass patterns that Portnoy plays on Erotomania. I love James's. James LaBrie took some vocal lessons leading into this album. He's got some great gritty and throaty vocals on tracks like Caught in a Web and Voices and The Mirror. Really interesting sound he came up with. When I first heard these songs, I didn't know who I was listening to, and it did not sound like James LaBrie on Images and Words. It sounded like a totally different singer. These 2 albums, Images and Words and Awake, are James' 2 best albums. It's before he had the incident with the bloody vocal cords, which happened, I think, was food poisoning. After this album was released, after this album was recorded, there's no weak songs on this album. You have the moody Space Divest, which, if you really want to get the best version of Space Divest, believe it or not, it's the live version that was released in 2014, Breaking the Fourth Wall. James goes up an octave on the majority of the vocals. It's more subdued on this album. That song still works, obviously. I love the keyboard and guitar harmony on Caught in a Web. I think that's classic Dream Theater. So this is my number 2 album, and that's kind of where I am with that. What do you think?
Yeah, this was definitely, when it came out, you didn't get the feeling that they were just going to give you an Images and Words Part 2. As you said, you made some good points about the drum sound. He just threw that out the window and went in a totally different direction. So yeah, this was the last time we got to hear Kevin Moore with the band. So yeah, great album all the way through.
So now we're going to get to your number 1, and we'll go backwards. I'm going to pull up, we're going to go back to my number 3, and I'm going to pull up 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. I'm pulling up, because I shared my screen before with the first disc, and now I'm sharing the second disc 2, which is the epic 42-minute track, the title track, 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, your number 1 Dream Theater album. Take it away.
Okay, so yeah, I wasn't sure if I wanted to bump this up to number 1 over my number 2. And I don't know, maybe if I wake up tomorrow morning, I'll think, oh, I should have kept Metropolis Part Two number one. But the reason I put this number one is because I thought it was more spontaneous, and I think it shows Jordan Rudess at his best. The first disc is so aggressive and technical. I love the arrangements on Misunderstood and how the song is presented musically, not lyrically, which you already covered, but musically, it reminds me of "In My Time of Dying." Remember that song by Led Zeppelin, which starts out that clean guitar and then builds up. Reminds me of that musically, but it gets even more powerful and spontaneous at the end of the song. The best song on the album from the first disc, and I realize there's no people usually don't listen to CDs anymore, but back when this came out, it was the best song on the first disc, called "The Great Debate," which eases you into the flow of the song with references to stem cell research. And then it hits you with the chorus, followed by all the intensity, and the instrumental section makes it a really memorable song. I also think "Disappear" is really cool because they're coming at you with something different and totally unexpected. And I think that's an element of the band that maybe hasn't been there in a while if you listen to their more recent work. And I love the production on that song. I think Jordan did a nice job with the spooky keyboards there, which kind of puts you in a different place as a listener. The only drawback on this is that the second track, entitled "Blind Faith," I think is a little bit long-winded. I think they got a little bit formulaic on that song. But I love the 14-minute opener. I think that just blows you away with its intensity and instrumentation. Um, Last but not least, the 42-minute epic is a masterpiece from start to finish. Jordan Rudess stands out on this one with that massive keyboard section in the overture. I think this is his best moment um, since he joined the band. The arrangements are absolutely beautiful. The pompous ending of the first part leads into the piano melody for the first track that has vocals, which is part two. So that they give you a great dynamic range on this. And I think it's mostly due to Jordan's contributions. In spite of the lyrics being somewhat cringeworthy on the 42-minute epic, they overcome that with the way the band takes you from one person's life challenges to the other's life challenges, from the two heavy parts, which deal with mental illness and post-traumatic stress disorder, to the two more melodic parts. It makes it totally breathtaking. The song has everything: the orchestral sound, the heavy parts, when the lyrics are great, to the Celtic feel that Jordan brings in with that memorable solo in the beginning of "Solitary Shell." The production on this album is off the charts good. With the pompous ending to the title track, the song is a masterpiece. So that's my number one.
Yeah, well, I think we're pretty close on these albums. I had it number three.
Yeah.
Some of the songs are unforgettable in the context of Dream Theater. I disagree. I think Blind Faith is well executed. I love the guitar and keyboard unison harmony in the middle of that song. Love Petrucci's heavy instrumentation on that song. I think it has a soulful melody. I just again, my one criticism of this album is that the drums are a little bit over engineered or overproduced. Um, they're borderline distorted on some of his tom fills. That's really my only criticism of the album. Otherwise, I think it's a great collection of songs. Um, One thing you'll hear in the Glass Prison at the end is a Neil Peart reference to part of the Hemispheres lyrics. I'll let the listener look that up. But he does use the sphere from Neil Peart. And that's again, a couple of the other things, on Blind Faith. Jordan goes into a little piano interlude in the middle of that song. I believe he repeats that on "A View from the Top of the World." I think track 6, "Transcending Time." He does a little interlude that kind of mirrors that. So
Yeah.
that's a repeating theme for Jordan. I think Blind Faith is a fan favorite. Again, interesting lyrical contribution from James. But otherwise, just a great top to bottom album with a lot of soulful melodies. Love the Led Zeppelin reference that you mentioned. I agree. There's some similarities there. So that's your number one. and we're gonna go to One More Time. It's the last album we'll talk about, and this is Images and Words, my number one. You had this a little bit lower, but I think we can agree that this was the statement that the band needed when they released it. I don't know if this album hadn't been as aggressive and as progressive with two rock anthems, Pull Me Under and Take the Time. Those were both videos on MTV that they played pretty much after this album. Lie got a little bit of play on MTV. But really Pull Me Under and Take the Time, getting a decent rotation on MTV, launched this band into a different stratosphere as far as progressive rock, and this album established, I believe, what is the progressive metal genre that so many bands try to imitate today. Um, and as you mentioned, Petrucci and the rest of the band members, particularly Petrucci, often refers back to this album. Perfect example is track 3 off of A View from the Top of the World, uses a Metropolis reference in the riff. Every time he does it, it works. As a Dream Theater fan, you'll hear it. As a casual listener, you probably won't hear the reference, but every time he uses it, it works. I expect to hear more of this on Parasomnia. As far as the album, I think it has a great overall mix. You mentioned the fact that My Young is prominent on this album, and some of the following albums, not so much. I think, Portnoy, what stood out to me when I first heard this album, one of the things that stood out to me was the double bass patterns that Portnoy came up. So creative. Before that, it was kind of just Lars Ulrich doing 16th notes that were lower in the mix. Portnoy's double bass drum was higher in the mix and more prominent and more part of the songwriting. It was an integral part of this album, which was new to me when I first heard it 32 years ago. As far as Labríe's soaring vocals, he's 2 or 3 octaves higher on this album than he is on any other Dream Theater album, with the exception of maybe Awake. Surrounded, his vocals are amazing, breathtaking. I wish he hadn't had the vocal accident, but you always have these 2 albums to refer back to as far as his talent goes. Pull Me Under was the song that launched this band. As I mentioned, I think Kevin Moore's lyrical contribution is missed to this day. And he shows his lyrical contribution in songs on this album, like Pull Me Under, which at the end has some lines from Hamlet. That song deals with his struggle as far as his indecision, which is also part of Hamlet. The main theme in Hamlet is Hamlet's indecision about what to do about his father or his uncle and his mother. And, Kevin Moore uses that as a metaphor for his own indecision about leaving the band. So I think that's an interesting lyrical contribution. I love the funky guitar on Take the Time. I love the keyboard and the guitar unison throughout this album. You mentioned Metropolis Part 1, the middle instrumental section, which I think is now legendary, and it basically drew in a generation of Dream Theater fans. And I still hear high school kids now referring back to that as something they've never heard before and probably never will. Love the African drum beat on Metropolis, which is creative and unique. We talked a little bit about the controversy over the snare trigger. Quite frankly, I like the snare trigger when I hear these songs mixed on their greatest hits album or their greatest hit album without the trigger. I think it sounds a little bit dry, and I think, like you said, it adds something to the mix. It adds something to the quality of the album. What else? Oh, Under a Glass Moon. This is classic Dream Theater, classic Mike Portnoy. There's a drum solo in the middle, if you can call it a drum solo. It's a quasi drum solo. odd time. It sounds odd time. There's upbeats, there's downbeats on the snare. I think Under a Glass Moon also has John Petrucci's best guitar solo, one of his best guitar solos, if not the best Petrucci guitar solo on Under a Glass Moon. Guitars are a little bit lower in the mix on this album. I think it still works. I think he has a unique sound on this album that he never really got back to. After this album, he kind of went much more heavier and darker with the 7th string and then ultimately the 8th string. I think this album sounds a little bit more like Alex Lifeson. And that's where I am on this album. And then lastly, Learning to Live, which I think is the quintessential Dream Theater song. It has the great lyrics by John Myung, which references Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged in the first couple of lines. I think the keyboard leads on this song and throughout the album are reminiscent of Yes's Drama. If you want to listen to that album, if you've already heard it. And again, this was such a monumental album for the band that they continue to reference it. Even today, I'm sure you hear a lot of View from the Top of the World reference Metropolis, Metropolis and some of the other stuff. You'll hear in track 3 on Train of Thought, you'll hear the Surrounded melody kind of in the middle of the song. They kind of use that and they make it a little bit different, and they do a harmony with keyboard and guitar. I think it's a great overall mix. Again, I think I said that. That's kind of where I am. What are your thoughts? Anything to end our last session of Dream Theater commentary and enthusiasm?
No, good analysis there about images and words. And every track on this album is really strong, and it's got that phenomenal ending with Learning to Live. I thought we would talk a little bit about the new where this band is going, like the transition back to Mike Portnoy and where they're going with this new track here. And I don't want to be a spoiler and talk about what their live show is going to be, because people might not want to know what those songs are going to be. But I'll just we're going to talk about this new song, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So when you first told me, I remember you texted me whatever it was about a year ago. It was October of last year. I scratched my head and I said, well, this has got to be a business move, because they had their attendance had clearly been suffering a little bit, and I'll show you what I mean. This is a picture I took when you and me saw that famous show at the Beacon Theater in March of 2022. And if you notice, for about 5 rows in front of us, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 rows, there's nobody sitting in any of these seats.
It was empty.
It was totally empty. Yeah, maybe there were 800 or 1,000 people there, Mike Portnoy being one of them.
Right.
But I mean, so that's why I said I thought when they hired him back that it was really to so that they could make money touring, because that's the only way they can make money these days. This is a touring machine, and sure enough, they're playing arenas now in Europe.
In Europe, yeah.
And they're not playing the Beacon Theater next year. They're playing Radio City, which is twice the size as the Beacon Theater, and then I'm pretty sure they sold it out, right?
I'm sure they did. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, so when you listen to this new album and you see that they're actually recycling names now. And I hope they didn't phone it in, but the name of the first single is Night Terror. Well, they already covered this in their False Awakening Street. The part 2 of False Awakening Street is called Night Terrors, plural. And now they're giving us Night Terror. Wow. I mean, it just seems like maybe they phoned this one in. And when you get to 3 minutes and 17 seconds on this track, you'll hear Jordan reverting to that predictable dive bomb. Wow! And I just can't help but laugh every time I hear that. So,
Right.
again, the track, it's a strong track. I mean, obviously, it's technically interesting. There's some cool riffs. Portnoy sounds great on the drums. You're like, all right, they're back. But then, you have Jordan falling into these same tropes that, just kind of makes you laugh because you've heard these things so many times. And I just hope the rest of the album isn't phoned in like this. I mean, at least you could change the name of the song. You give us a new title. It's like, how long did they really think about this whole thing? The concept of this album. Well, we're going to be dark and scary this time. Well, you already did that with Black Eyes and Silver Linings.
Yeah. So
I just don't know how well
I
conceived
was
the thing is.
so I was a little disappointed with this Night Terror track. I think I'll mirror what you said about the keyboard solo. It sounds like typical wah wah, you know, Jordan sounding out of place with his
Yeah.
guitar with his keyboard solo. So there's that. But just in general, the song kind of drags, and I find myself putting this song on almost every day because it's a new Dream Theater song. And then before I know it, I've spaced out and I've missed the entire song. I find myself a little bit more engaged when I watch the video because I can see the guys playing, and then I find
Right.
myself enjoying it a little bit more. But honestly, it's kind of a boring song. I agree with you. I first when I first heard it, I thought it sounded like a little bit like Nightmare to Remember, and they like you said they already used this title, and quite frankly they used it twice with Night Terrors and Nightmare to Remember, and now Night Terror again. It's kind of a dark song. Portnoy mentioned that they just wanted to release a song that kind of checked all the boxes. It had a great guitar solo. It had big drums. I'll give them, I think, Andy Sneap, who you mentioned on one of our previous broadcasts. It does sound like a well engineered drum sound. They're not going for, they went back to a Portnoy drum sound, a more natural, organic sound, other than that triggered snare that we've heard for the past 13 years. A lot of triggers, which is what I think Petrucci prefers. He prefers it to sound like images and words. So I think you'll get a better organic drum sound, but I'm a little disappointed with the first track. So I have to agree with you on that. There's some interesting instrumental stuff, but nothing that blows you away. Nothing like when I first heard the Alien 3 years ago, I was blown away. I was expecting big things about that album. I wasn't disappointed, and I can say right now I'm a little disappointed with Night Terror, and I have my fingers crossed as far as what's to come next on February 7th, yeah, of 2025, which is actually the same day of the opening show in Philadelphia of the U.S. tour. So that'll be an interesting day. I'm not sure if I'm going to that show or not, but I could. So we'll see. But that's kind of where we have it right now. Anything else as far as Dream Theater and any other comments you want to make? I mean, this is what you and I agree is the most exciting progressive band that combines Metallica, Rush, Yes, Genesis, and U2. It's those bands all rolled into one. We hope you enjoyed our series. This has been the top three Dream Theater albums. Anything else from you, Sean, before we sign off?
No, that's just about it. I mean, definitely. Yeah, in terms of this reunion, I do hope that and I understand it's the world we live in. You don't make a lot of money off, by making a great album anymore. You're gonna make your money touring. So I understand that's why he came back to the band. But I would be disappointed if at some point they didn't allow him to get, because I don't know how involved he was at this point in songwriting. I mean, look at, it would just be good to see more of his personality in it instead of just, you know doing the same predictable double bass and stuff like that.
The new song did sound predictable. I didn't hear anything interesting or new. Like I said, I think Andy Sneap probably did a great job with this album, engineering and mixing and mastering. I'm sure it'll sound great. So no disappointment on the sound of the album, but definitely it sounds a little tired. And let's hope for the best. So happy holidays to everybody. I hope you enjoyed our series and look for more to come on other progressive bands in the future. Signing off, Neil and Sean, the Prog Rogs. Take care.
Yeah, so we should do. If you want to do another band, would you feel comfortable doing another band?
Hold on a second.
Sure.